Satang Prasanga.
Hare Krishna, dear devotees. I pray that all is well with you and your families at the moment, and that you are going through the lockdown with a little more ease. So today's session, today's sutra is as follows. Good may occur by Krishna's will, despite the lack of expertise or even good, or the inclusion of malice in the hearts of those who have been instrumental to Krishna. Not a blade of grass moves without Krishna's sanction. Although grudges should not be held towards others, one should nevertheless act practically in one's dealings. We see in Vedic Sankhya the understanding of what is matter. It gives a very beautiful description to understand what we actually experiencing here in this material world, as it explains what is duality. So when we are trying to understand what is good, we also have to understand the opposite of it, what is bad or evil. But the deep illumination that the Sankhya gives is that darkness in itself doesn't exist. Darkness is simply the absence of light. So the essence is light. So evil in itself actually doesn't exist. It's the absence of goodness. The degree of absence of goodness, that's the degree of evil that will exist. So if we're trying to understand that concept in terms of our experience in this material world, how do we see that there's so much of evil? Is because there's so much of lack of good. This is why the degradation of the yugas gradually start from Satya Yuga, where there's almost like a state of absolute goodness, and then it degrades right down to Kali Yuga. So Kali Yuga is the yuga, the age of quarrel and hypocrisy, but that is simply a symptom of the lack of goodness. The degree of lack of goodness is manifesting as Kali Yuga. So actually in and itself there is no evil or bad. It's the degree of lack of goodness. It's a beautiful concept because it makes you understand, because how can evil exist then? That means in the world, that means the Lord has also created evil. He has not created evil. He has only created goodness. But the degree of consciousness that moves away from Him, that becomes evil. So it moves away from Krishna-centered existence to self-centered existence. So the more self-centered we become, the more evil we become, the more bad we become, and the more Krishna conscious we become, the more Krishna-centered we become. So it's a very illuminating concept. Our sutra today says, good may occur by Krishna's will despite the lack of expertise or even good. That means whether we have the qualifications or not, Krishna can empower any living entity. I remember in Leela Amrita, Shyama Sundar Prabhu, he would describe this as the Krishna miracle, to expect the Lord to intervene in one's life. The beautiful example is one day they were walking, they didn't have enough money to pay for the rent, and all of a sudden money started falling out of the sky. it's unbelievable. Dollars started falling out of the sky. And they collected it all up and they were managed to pay the rent. So there were instances like this where Krishna would arrange, even meeting great people like George Harrison and celebrities like that. How did those arrangements happen? It's not that the devotees had great expertise. No, they were dedicated to Krishna. Their heart was given to Srila Prabhupada. And by that, these arrangements then started to occur. It goes on to say, in the hearts of those who have been instrumental to Krishna. So as soon as we try to serve Krishna, we see that something happens. There's a switch that happens within the heart where one now becomes connected to that spiritual energy. Krishna says in Gita, Mahatmanas tumam partha devim prakriti ashrita. That those who are great souls, Mahatmas, they take shelter. Devim prakriti ashrita. They take shelter of the divine energy, not the material energy. And the next verse, how do they do that? Satatam kirtayanto mam yetantasya dhritavrata namasham chastamam bhaktya nitya yukta upasate. That they do that by satatam kirtan, by chanting, by doing spiritual activity, devotional service, but mainly by chanting the Lord's glories. So this is how they take shelter. So we see even with the demoniac consciousness, there's still some vestiges of goodness there. Ravana was a Brahmana, kind of Brahmin person, but his consciousness went demoniac. Hiranyakashipu did great amounts of tapasya. We couldn't even do any of that today. So you must have some level of goodness in order to do that kind of thing. Kamsa spoke great philosophy to Vasudeva just when he was about to kill Devaki. So these are all, there's some vestiges of goodness there, of devotion, of connection to the spiritual Godhead. Their independence, they choose to move away from the Godhead, and therefore gradually they become more and more self-centered in their understanding, in their practice, in their behavior. We see it goes on to say, not a blade of grass moves without Krishna's sanction. We hear this analogy so many times, it's like a cliche now. But do we believe it? To what degree do you believe this, that a blade of grass even doesn't move without the Lord's sanction? Because if it had to move without Krishna's sanction, that means who is controlling it? Somebody is controlling it who is not Krishna. That means there's another kind of God. There can only be one absolute Godhead. So everything is under his jurisdiction, being controlled by time. Krishna declares this. Time is the factor that controls and moves everything. So even a blade of grass. So if a blade of grass then is moved by Krishna's will, can you imagine our events and arrangements in life, especially if we are devotees? It's very auspicious, very auspicious. It goes on to say, although grudges should not be held towards others, one should nevertheless act practically in one's dealings. I was just remembering Devi Shakti Mataji was speaking 2 days back about Prabhupada's final moments, and in that room she described a very amazing situation. It was very solemn, and Prabhupada was like hours before leaving his body, and all the devotees are there, and then Prabhupada says, your love to me will be shown by how much you cooperate with each other. And then he began to cry. And this was a very powerful, because everybody in the room then began to cry. And then we realized devotees then realize that this is the essential thing. ISKCON is not made up of just the buildings and the temples and the teachings and the philosophy and the services. ISKCON, the heart of ISKCON, the pulse of ISKCON is cooperation, of how we understand each other. And cooperation also has its jurisdiction, that I may not agree with you. We agree to disagree. So I'll cooperate with you. I may not agree with what you said, but I'll cooperate with you. And actually, if you think about it, one must be super impudent not to cooperate. Because by not cooperating, you are enforcing your point of view, and that is giving the notion that your point of view is absolute and is the only way. And we see that not how the planet works. That's not how creation works. There's so many points of view. Yours maybe happen to be the most strongest point of view, the most logical, the most practical, but is it the best? Well, that's hard to say. So because there's so many factors involved. There's so many factors involved in life. From your perspective right now, maybe from the humanistic perspective is the most practical. But there's Deva Natrena. There's the divine intervention as well. So it will be a little impudent to think that my perspective is definitely the absolute. So without cooperating, without getting the view of everyone, then how do you know? How will you know? Therefore, Prabhupada, when he inaugurated the management structure of ISKCON, under the guidance of Bhaktisiddhanta, he wanted to have a GBC, governing body, because everybody gives their input, and then you'll get a perspective which you probably never thought about or you didn't see, because everybody is on different levels of connection to Krishna, different levels of consciousness. So it's important to understand the principle of cooperation, as this is the heart of love. This is the pulse of love. Prabhupada said that and started crying, because he understood that if you get this point, there's definitely going to be discrepancies and disagreements amongst devotees. We even get it amongst acharyas. There's some acharyas who will say something and another acharya will say something else totally opposite. And then you wonder, hey, who's right now? Both are right. Huh? Who's right? I'm reminded of the story. The devotees went to Prabhupada, I think it was Tama Krishna Maharaj, and said, Prabhupada, who is stronger, Krishna or Balaram? And then devotee said, no, Krishna must be stronger because he is the source of everything. Prabhupada said, yes, you're right. And then they said, but also we see here in Krishna Balaram temple, Balaram is putting his hand on Krishna's shoulder, therefore he must be stronger or bigger. Yes, that person is right. He says, oh, he is also right. Oh, Prabhupada, then how can both be right? You also right? So all three are right. This is Krishna. Everything is reconciled in Krishna. Because everything, if it exists even as a thought, that means it's coming from Krishna only. So everything is reconciled in Krishna. Therefore, if we just take one perspective and think, no, this practically right now, this looks like the best option. Yes, but that's only from your point of view. Therefore, not to cooperate is actually a sign of impudence. That's all. Just false ego. And in Prabhupada's perspective, cooperation is an expression of love. So it's a very sweet moment. It's a difficult moment because love also means sacrifice. The sweetness of love is also in sacrifice. So I hope you enjoyed the class today. Please join us again tomorrow. Hare Krishna.